You want to know something that bothered the Keth'vari High Council for 11 years? It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a fleet, it wasn't even a treaty. It was a question. One single question that the most decorated military strategist in the Keth'vari Empire, a being named Vorath Sel, who had planned the obliteration of 4 civilizations and the subjugation of 9 others, could not answer. The question was this: why don't we just attack the humans? And nobody, not Vorath Sel, not the Council's war priests, not the admirals who commanded fleets that stretched across 11-star systems, nobody could give a satisfying answer. Not because the answer was complicated. Because the answer was terrifying. And I know, because I was there when they finally found out. My name is Dara Osai. I was 34 years old when I boarded the INS Perseverance as a junior diplomatic attaché, and I was 36 when I watched an alien fleet, 700 ships strong, turn around and go home without firing a single shot. This is what happened. This is what they learned. And I promise you, by the time I'm done talking, you'll understand why the galaxy doesn't sleep easy anymore. Black large square setup. Let me paint you a picture first, because context matters. The year is 2187. Humanity has been spacefaring for about 60 years, real spacefaring, I mean, not the early stumbling around with chemical rockets and solar sails. We found the Vorath Drive in 2127, almost by accident, buried inside a derelict probe that had been floating between Jupiter and Saturn for God knows how long. Nobody ever figured out who made it. We just reverse-engineered it, scaled it up, and started pushing outward. By 2187, we had established 14 colonies across 7 systems, small ones mostly, mining operations, research stations, 1 full agricultural world on Kepler 452b that we just called green. Population across all 14, maybe 80 million, a drop in the cosmic ocean. We had also, in those 60 years, managed to make contact with 12 alien civilizations. 4 of them were friendly, 3 were cautiously neutral. 2 were openly hostile but not yet aggressive. Think of 2 people at a bar who don't like each other but haven't thrown a punch. 2 more were so far removed from us, biologically and culturally, that communication was more theoretical than real. And 1, the Keth'vari, were something else entirely. The Keth'vari were the big ones, the old ones. They'd been empire building for 3,000 years. They had something like 600 inhabited systems. Their military was, by any reasonable metric, the most powerful force in this arm of the galaxy. They had weapons that could crack moons, fleets that blotted out stars. They had destroyed civilizations that were older than the Roman Empire, and they had done it with the casual efficiency of a man swatting a fly. And yet, for 11 years, from our first contact in 2176 to the incident I'm about to describe in 2187, the Keth'vari had not attacked us. People back home thought it was because of diplomacy. They thought it was because of the treaties we'd signed, the trade agreements, the carefully worded non-aggression pacts that our ambassadors had sweated blood over. I was a diplomat. I was one of the people who wrote those agreements. And I can tell you, with complete honesty, that the agreements had nothing to do with it. The Keth'vari weren't staying their hand because of paperwork. They were staying their hand because they were afraid. They just didn't know what they were afraid of yet. I was stationed aboard the INS Perseverance, a diplomatic cruiser technically, though she carried enough defensive armament to make any attacker think twice. About 400 meters long, crew of about 300, and she looked, honestly, more like a flying building than a warship. Lots of glass, lots of open space inside. The designers had wanted her to feel welcoming to alien dignitaries, so they'd built wide corridors and tall ceilings and put observation lounges everywhere. I loved that ship. I loved the way she felt in the morning, if you could call it morning in deep space. The environmental systems would warm the light slowly. the way sunrise does, and you'd wake up and the stars would be outside your window, and for a moment you'd forget that you were sitting inside a metal tube hurtling through the void and you'd just feel okay. I had a small office near the diplomatic section, starboard side, level 4. My desk faced a porthole. I'd spent the better part of 2 years staring out that porthole at nothing in particular, drafting language for agreements that I suspected nobody was actually going to honor. My commanding officer, diplomatic commanding officer, not military, was Ambassador Priya Nair. She was 52, originally from Chennai, and she had a way of making you feel both very small and very capable at the same time. She'd been doing this work for 20 years. She had shaken hands, or whatever passed for hands, with more alien dignitaries than anyone else alive. And she was, as I would come to learn, one of the very few humans who had actually begun to understand what made the Keth'vari tick. She called me into her office on the morning of March 14, 2187. That date is burned into me. I will remember it for the rest of my life. She was standing at her window when I came in, which was unusual. Priya Nair always sat. She said it made alien visitors feel less dominated, which made sense. She was short, barely 160 centimeters, but she had a presence that could fill a room, and she'd learned to dial it back. She wasn't dialing it back that morning. She was standing, and she was very still, and she was looking at something on the edge of the scanner display. "Close the door," she said. I closed it. "Do you know what a Keth'vari war formation looks like, Dara?" I said I'd seen diagrams. "Then look at this and tell me what you see." She turned the display toward me. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at it for a longer moment. "That's a lot of ships," I finally said. 712, she said. "Verified by 3 independent scanner arrays. The military already knows. Captain Reyes has been on the bridge since 400. 712 Keth'vari warships, sitting at the edge of the Kepler system, roughly 8 light minutes from Earth's first and only agricultural colony. 80 million people across 14 colonies, 80 million human beings, and 700 warships that had cracked moons." I remember my mouth going dry. I remember the way my hands felt sort of distant, like they belonged to someone else. I remember the sound of the ship's air recyclers, which I'd stopped hearing months ago, suddenly very loud. "Are they?" I started. "Not moving," Priya said. "Not yet, but they've deployed into what our military analysts are calling a pre-engagement spread, which means they're ready. They're just not firing." "What are we doing?" She almost smiled. "Right now we're waiting, and so are they." Black large square build tension. Here's the thing about waiting in space. It's not like waiting in a lobby. It's not like waiting for a bus. There's no ambient noise to fill the silence, no small movements to distract you. The ship is just there, and the stars are just there, and somewhere in the dark, 700 warships are sitting at the edge of weapons range, and time stops having the same quality it normally does. The Perseverance went to what Captain Reyes called elevated readiness. Not full battle stations. That would have been an escalation, and escalation was the one thing we absolutely could not afford. But the defensive systems came online, quiet and thorough. The armor plating shifted into configuration. The point defense grid cycled up, and 300 people moved through their days with the careful, controlled energy of people who knew something was wrong and had decided not to panic about it. I went to the bridge at 800. I wasn't strictly supposed to be there. It was a military space, and I was a diplomatic attaché. But Captain Reyes was one of those rare commanders who believed that information should flow freely, especially in a crisis, and she'd given civilian staff informal clearance to observe. Captain Reyes herself was. Let me think about how to describe her. She was from Bogota, mid-40s. She had the kind of face that had spent a long time outdoors before she ever went to space, weathered, I suppose, but in a way that made her look solid rather than worn. She spoke quietly, almost always in that deliberate way of someone who had trained themselves not to waste words. She was standing at the central console when I came onto the bridge, and she was looking at the same thing everyone else was looking at. The scanner display, 712 signatures, not moving. "Mr. Osei," she said without turning around, "I expected you earlier." "I was getting coffee," I said, for lack of anything better to do. She almost smiled. There's something to be said for that. I stood beside her and looked at the display. The Keth'vari formation was beautiful in the way that dangerous things sometimes are. They arranged themselves in something between a sphere and a wedge, their command vessels at the center, their heaviest warships forming the outer shell, their support craft woven between like thread through cloth. It was a formation designed to survive, to absorb punishment and keep functioning even as the outer layers were stripped away. It was also a formation that had ended civilizations. "Have they communicated?" I asked. "One signal," Reyes said, 14 minutes ago, encrypted in standard Keth'vari diplomatic cipher. We're still decoding." "Diplomatic cipher," I said, "not military." She looked at me then. "That's the thing, isn't it? Whoever's in charge over there, and our analysis suggests it's Vorath Sel himself, which is," she paused, "significant. Vorath Sel sent a diplomatic communication, not a military one." I stood there and thought about that for a moment. Vorath Sel was a name I knew well. He was the Keth'vari Empire's most accomplished military commander, yes, but he was also, paradoxically, one of their most sophisticated political thinkers. He was the being who had negotiated the absorption of 3 systems without firing a shot, using a combination of economic pressure and cultural destabilization that human historians would spend decades studying. He was brutal and he was brilliant, and the fact that he had chosen a diplomatic channel was either very good news or very carefully constructed bait. "Ambassador Nair is being briefed," I asked. "She's already drafting a response," Reyes said. "She wants you back in the diplomatic section inside the hour." I took one more look at the 712 signatures on the display. "Captain," I said. "Yes." "In your judgment, are they going to attack?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about that since 400, and I keep coming back to the same answer." "Which is?" "I don't know, but I think they don't know either." She looked at the display, and that might be the most frightening part. The decoded message arrived in the diplomatic section at 9:23. I was there when Priya read it. I watched her face while she read, which was always more informative than whatever she said afterward. Priya Nair had a diplomat's face, expressive enough to make you feel heard, controlled enough to never give away more than she intended. But there were tells, small ones, if you'd worked with her long enough. She read the message. Her chin lifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. "They want a meeting," she said. "A meeting," I repeated. "Face to face, on neutral ground." She set the document down. "They suggest the station." The station was Relay Point 7, a small, jointly maintained waypoint about 2 light minutes from our position. It was technically neutral, maintained by a consortium of 4 spacefaring civilizations, including both humans and the Keth'vari. It had a meeting chamber specifically designed for high-stakes diplomatic encounters, pressure-neutral, atmospherically adjustable, with full recording capability and a security perimeter that both sides were supposed to honor. "Vorath Sel wants to meet," I said. "The man who planned the fall of the Dreth homeworld wants to sit down at a table." "So it would seem," Priya said. "And the 700 ships are there why?" She looked at me steadily. "I think that's exactly what we're going to find out." We took a shuttle to Relay Point 7. Ambassador Nair, myself, our security attaché Major Tomoko Watanabe, who was compact and quiet, and had a way of scanning a room that made you feel like She'd already figured out every exit and every threat before you'd finished sitting down, and 2 additional diplomatic staff. 5 humans, on a station that currently also held, according to our scanners, approximately 400 Keth'vari personnel. Major Watnabe said nothing about the numbers. She just adjusted the weight of the sidearm on her hip and watched the corridor as we walked. The Keth'vari were tall. That's the first thing you noticed about them. Most humans did. They ranged from about 2 meters to nearly 3, bipedal, with a secondary set of limbs that were too small for heavy lifting but too articulated for pure gesture. They used them for fine manipulation and for emotional signaling, the way humans used facial expressions. Their faces were angular, almost architectural, with large forward-set eyes that were excellent in low light and a jaw structure that could unhinge slightly for threat display. They were covered in a kind of fine, interlocking scale that shaded from slate gray in the cold to a warm amber in heat. They were also, and this part matters, very, very old as a civilization, 3,000 years of organized expansion. They had seen things humanity hadn't begun to imagine. They'd watched species rise and fall. They'd made decisions about entire worlds. And they were, right now, choosing to hold a meeting instead of firing. That still meant something, I just didn't know what. The meeting chamber was circular, which was intentional, no head of the table, no positional advantage. The Keth'vari were already there when we arrived, 5 of them seated on the curved bench across from our side of the chamber. In the center, taller than the others, sat a being I recognized from every intelligence briefing I'd ever read. Vorath Sel. He was older than I'd expected, based on the files. The scales around his secondary jaw were paler, almost white. His primary eyes, large amber, arranged for binocular vision, were fixed on Ambassador Nair with an expression that I couldn't entirely read. It was somewhere between appraisal and unease. Interesting unease. We sat. The universal translation system, a marvel of cooperative xenolinguistics that had taken 40 years to build, hummed quietly between us. Vorath Sel spoke first. That was unusual. Protocol dictated that the party who requested the meeting spoke second. He was breaking protocol, which meant he was either very confident or very unsettled. What he said, in translation, was this: I have studied your people for 9 of your years, and there is one thing I cannot understand. One thing that my best analysts, my finest strategists, my most experienced commanders cannot explain. I have come here today, with 700 warships at my back, because I want an answer to this question before I decide what to do next. Ambassador Nair was very still. Her hands were flat on the table. Her face was the diplomat's face, present, open, giving nothing away. Ask your question, she said. And Vorath Sel asked it. Why aren't you afraid? Black large square climax. I want to be careful here because I've told this story before and people always expect the climax to be a battle, an explosion, something cinematic and loud. It wasn't. The most terrifying moment in the history of human-Keth'vari relations happened in a quiet room, and it happened through words, and by the time it was over, Vorath Sel, a being who had commanded the destruction of civilizations, looked like a man who had just realized he'd been standing on the edge of a cliff without knowing it. Let me explain what I mean. After he asked his question, there was a long silence, long enough that I could hear the environmental system adjusting the temperature, long enough that one of the junior Keth'vari officers shifted in his seat. Ambassador Nair looked at Vorath Sel for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "Can you be more specific?" Vorath Sel leaned forward slightly. His secondary limbs twitched, emotional signaling. Our xenolinguists had told us, associated with something between frustration and urgency. Your species has been spacefaring for 60 years, he said. In that time you have encountered hostile civilizations. You have been threatened. You have been attacked twice, once by the Gret Collective, once by the Voran pirates. Both times you were outmatched. Both times you took casualties, and both times you did not stop. He paused. The Gret Collective attacked your mining station at Proxima Centauri b in 2134. They had superior numbers, superior weapons, and complete tactical surprise. Your station had 47 personnel and 3 armed escort vessels. The Gret expected surrender within 1 standard rotation. Instead, your people held that station for 19 days. 19 days with no resupply, no reinforcement, no realistic expectation of survival. They held it until your military response arrived. Of the 47, 29 survived. He looked at Priya. 29 survived, and when I reviewed the reports, the Gret reports, not yours, do you know what they described? They described your people singing. At night, when the power was low and the temperature dropped, they described your people singing. They didn't know what the songs were. They didn't understand them, but they found it disturbing. I felt something move through me when he said that. Not pride exactly, something more complicated. The Voran incident in 2149, he continued. Your colonists on Kepler 22b were raided for labor. The Voran took 63 individuals and departed. Your government's response was, he consulted something at his side. A single frigate, the ICS Meridian, crew of 42, armed with weapons that were, by every objective metric, inadequate against a Voran slaver configuration. He paused again. The Meridian tracked the Voran ship for 11 days across 3 star systems. They were fired upon 4 times. They sustained significant damage twice. They did not turn back. When they finally caught the Voran vessel at the edge of the Lur system, the Meridian had 17 crew still at their posts. The Voran ship had 400 crew. And the captain of the Meridian, he consulted again. A woman named Lieutenant Commander Grace Alderman, who at that point had been awake for approximately 60 standard hours, transmitted one message before engaging. He looked directly at Ambassador Nair. The message was, "We're coming in." That was the entirety of the transmission. "We're coming in." And then a frigate with 17 people attacked a slaver vessel with 400 and retrieved all 63 colonists. His secondary limbs went very still. Lieutenant Commander Alderman was severely injured in the engagement. She recovered, she was promoted, and she went back into service. He sat back. These are 2 incidents. I have a file of 97 more, and in every single one I find the same pattern. When threatened, your people do not calculate odds in the way that all other species we have encountered do. They calculate something else, something I have spent 9 years trying to name. The room was absolutely silent. Ambassador Nair said, very quietly, "What do you think they calculate?" And Vorath Sel said, "I think they calculate how much it would cost the other side." He explained what he meant, and as he explained, I started to understand why 700 warships were sitting at the edge of the Kepler system, not moving. Every civilization we have encountered, he said, performs the same logical process when faced with a superior force. They assess their own capacity. They assess the opposing force. They find the point where continued resistance becomes non-viable. And they stop. This is rational. This is how civilizations survive. He leaned forward again. Humans do not do this. Or rather, they do it, but they add a variable that no other civilization we have encountered adds. He paused for a long moment. Humans calculate what it will cost the attacker to win. He let that sit in the air. When the 47 personnel on your Proxima station assessed the Gret attack, they did not ask, "Can we win?" They asked, "How much will they bleed?" They chose a strategy not of survival but of attrition. They made themselves expensive. They held a position that was strategically worthless except for one purpose: to make the Gret pay for every centimeter. The Meridian did not pursue the Voran because Captain Alderman believed she could win a direct engagement with a superior vessel. She pursued because she had calculated that if she made the cost of keeping 63 humans high enough, in time, in fuel, in risk, in the political cost of a prolonged pursuit, the Voran would find the transaction unacceptable. She was right. His amber eyes were very steady. I have run simulations of an attack on your 14 colonies. My analysts have run them. We have run them 700 times. And in every simulation, every single one, we can take your colonies. We have the force, the technology, and the tactical capacity to do so. But in every simulation, the cost is catastrophic. His secondary limbs moved again, slower this time, something that read to me like exhaustion. Not in ships, not in material, in time, in energy, in the cascade of consequences, because your people do not have an off switch. Your people do not reach a logical endpoint and stop. Your people, he paused, as if choosing words with great care. Your people have developed the ability to transform defeat into a longer war. The Gret Station was 47 people. Your government sent 400 warships in response, not because it was strategically necessary, not because those 47 people had any military value, but because of something we have no word for, a drive, a compulsion, a refusal to accept the ledger as closed. He was quiet for a moment. In my culture, we have a concept. We call it the weight of the dead. It is a calculation. When a commander loses forces in battle, those losses are weighted against strategic value. When the losses exceed the value, the operation is reconsidered. It is logic. It is math. Your people also have a concept. I have studied it for years. You call it leaving no one behind. It is not a calculation. It is a commitment made before the engagement begins. It does not factor in strategic value. It does not factor in cost. It is simply, we will come. Whatever it takes, we will come. The silence that followed was different from the silence before, heavier. I have 700 ships, Vorath Sel said, and I know with certainty that I can destroy your colonies. But I also know with equal certainty that within one generation, within one human generation, your species would find a way to make us regret it. Not because you are militarily superior, because you are constitutionally incapable of letting it go. He looked at Ambassador Nair one final time. I wanted to ask you if I was right, before I made a decision. The room was quiet for a very long time. Ambassador Nair looked at him for what felt like minutes. Then she reached into her coat, slowly, clearly, with none of the abruptness that could be read as threat, and placed something on the table. A photograph, printed on physical paper, which was unusual enough that Vorath Sel's secondary limbs twitched with curiosity. Do you know what this is? She asked. He studied it, a memorial of some kind. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, she said. Washington, D.C., Earth. Built in 1982. It lists the names of 58,281 people. She let him look at it. Every name is a person who died in a war that, by the time it ended, many people felt had been a mistake. A war that had no clean victory. A war that, by any rational military analysis, was lost. She paused. We built a wall and put their names on it anyway, because we don't leave names behind either. She put the photograph back in her pocket. You asked if you were right, she said. About the nature of our people. Yes. Here's my answer, she said. I am not going to threaten you. I'm not going to tell you what we'll do if you attack. I'm not going to make promises about what humanity is capable of, because you've clearly done your research and you've clearly already run the numbers. She met his eyes, his large, amber, ancient eyes, without flinching. But I'll tell you what I can tell you. In 60 years of space travel, we've been threatened by 9 different civilizations. We've been attacked by 4, and we haven't gone home yet. Not once. We have not, as a species, not even close, decided that the stars are too dangerous and retreated to Earth. We have also not forgotten, she added very quietly, any of it. Vorath Sel was very still. You wanted to know why we aren't afraid, Priya said. That's the wrong question. We are afraid. Every one of those 47 people on that Proxima station was afraid. Grace Alderman was afraid. Every human who has ever faced something bigger and better armed than themselves has been afraid. She leaned forward slightly. The question is what we do with fear, and the answer is, we use it. We use it as fuel. We use it to push harder. We use it to make sure that whatever happens, whatever the cost, the thing that threatened us pays a price it wasn't expecting. She sat back. That's not a threat, Vorath Sel, it's just who we are. You wanted the terrifying truth, that's it. We don't know how to stop. Black large square resolution. The meeting lasted another 4 hours after that. I took notes. That's what I was there for. I sat and I listened and I wrote things down, and the whole time I was doing it, I had the feeling of watching something historic happen in real time. Not historic the way battles are historic, loud and definitive. Historic the way conversations sometimes are, when two understandings of the world collide and one of them has to make room. Vorath Sel asked questions. Real questions, the kind a scholar asks rather than the kind a commander asks. He wanted to know about our wars, not the space ones, but the ancient ones, the ones on Earth, thousands of years ago. He wanted to know why we kept fighting them. He wanted to know what it felt like from the inside to be a species that kept reaching for the stars after everything that had been done to us. Priya answered him honestly. She talked about history, about pattern, about the stubborn human instinct that seemed to believe, against all available evidence, often that the next thing would be better, that the next horizon would be worth the cost. She talked about the people who crossed oceans on wooden boats without knowing what was on the other side. She talked about the people who walked into deserts without knowing if they'd come back. She talked about the first astronauts, 21st century, chemical rockets, no Vorath drive, just a capsule and courage and the understanding that if something went wrong, there was no rescue coming. And she talked about the miners on Proxima Station, about what they would have known when the Gret fleet appeared, that they were 47 people, that help was weeks away, and that they had a choice. They could have surrendered. The Gret had offered terms initially. Surrender the station and all personnel would be processed for labor, which meant servitude, but it meant alive. 29 out of 47 chose to hold. Not because they thought they could win, but because they had decided that the station mattered, and that their dying in it would cost the Gret something, and that the cost would be worth it. Vorath Sel listened to all of this. His secondary limbs moved sometimes, and I watched them the way you watch a translator's face, looking for the emotional content beneath the words. What I saw was something I hadn't expected to see. Something like respect, but underneath it something else. Something like relief. At the end of the 4 hours, he said something that I have thought about almost every day since. I came here with 700 ships because I needed to know if an attack was viable. I have concluded that it is not. Not because you are stronger than us, you are not yet, but because the cost of what would follow is not a cost I am willing to ask my civilization to bear. He rose from his seat. The other Keth'vari rose with him. There is a concept among some of my people, he said, for a category of opponent that is more dangerous than their apparent strength would suggest. We call them Eth. The translation is imprecise, but it means something like those who cost more than they are worth to kill. He looked at Ambassador Nair. Your people are Vorketh. I say this not as an insult but as a military designation. It means we will not attack you. It means we will not, if we are wise, provoke you. It means that any engagement with your species is, by definition, a poor transaction. He paused. You should know that this assessment will be shared with the High Council and with our allies. I expect that within 5 of your years, it will be known across most of this arm of the galaxy." He tilted his head slightly, a Keth'vari gesture I'd learned to read as a kind of bow, something between acknowledgement and respect. "You are a young civilization," he said, "and you are very strange, but I find to my surprise that I do not wish you harm." He left. 400 Keth'vari personnel filed out of the station with the same quiet efficiency with which they'd arrived. Our shuttle returned to the Perseverance, and on the scanner display, over the course of the next 6 hours, we watched 712 Keth'vari warships turn and move away from the Kepler system. They didn't charge their weapons, they didn't make any threatening gestures, they just turned around and went home. Captain Reyes stood on her bridge and watched until the last signature vanished from the display. Then she said, very quietly, "Someone get Ambassador Nair a proper cup of tea." And that was that. Black large square ending line. People ask me sometimes what the real takeaway from that day was, what I think it meant for humanity, for the galaxy, for all of it. I usually pause before I answer, because the honest answer is complicated and people expect something simpler. Here's what I say. The Keth'vari came with 700 ships because they wanted to know if we were dangerous. They left because they found out we were. And the thing that made us dangerous wasn't our weapons or our technology or our numbers. It was the thing that Grace Alderman proved with a damaged frigate and 17 people. It was the thing that 47 miners proved on a station at Proxima Centauri. It was the thing that Ambassador Nair proved in a room at Relay Point 7, with a photograph on a table and no warships at her back. We don't know when to stop. Not because we're stupid, not because we're suicidal, but because somewhere in our DNA, somewhere in the long, difficult story of our species, we developed a relationship with cost that most civilizations never did. We learned not in space, but on a muddy little planet over 10,000 years of trying, that the things worth keeping are always the things someone was willing to die to hold. And that calculus, that terrible, stubborn, irrational-looking calculus, is the most frightening thing in the galaxy. Not because it means we win every fight. Because it means we never stop fighting for the ones that matter. End of Part 1. Part 2. Document style, narrated script. Black large square hook. 3 months after the Keth'vari fleet turned around at the edge of the Kepler system, a communications officer named Specialist Yusuf Tanaka recorded something in his personal log that I think about every time someone asks me about that year. He wrote, "I have started to think that the galaxy was watching us before we ever looked up, and I don't know if that's terrifying or beautiful. Maybe it's both." He was 26 years old. He joined the crew of the INS Perseverance straight out of the academy, and in his 18 months aboard, the most dramatic thing that had happened to him, before all of this, was a navigation error that put us 3 hours off course in the Barnard Star approach corridor. After the Keth'vari fleet left, Yusuf Tanaka stopped sleeping well, not because he was afraid, because he'd understood something that hadn't fully landed for the rest of us yet. We had been watched. For years, possibly. Observed, assessed, catalogued. Not just by the Keth'vari, but by others, the quieter ones, the civilizations that watched from the edges and let the big powers do the front row testing. There was a whole ecosystem of intelligence gathering out there, and humanity had been the subject of it for God knows how long. And that changed things. Because here's what Yusuf had figured out, lying awake in his bunk in the communications section, 3 weeks after the meeting at Relay Point 7. If the Keth'vari had been afraid of us, who else was? And more importantly, who wasn't? Black large square setup. The INS Perseverance didn't go home after the Keth'vari incident. That's not how diplomacy works. You don't just pack up and leave when one crisis resolves, because diplomacy, more than anything else, is about presence, about staying in the room, about being there when the next thing happens. And the next thing happened quickly. Within 6 weeks of the Keth'vari withdrawal, we received formal communications from 3 other spacefaring civilizations: the Selhari Directorate, the Vorath Communion, and a civilization I'd never heard of before, referred to in our records only as the Pale Union. All 3 requested diplomatic engagement. All 3 cited, in some form or another, reassessment of the human position. All 3 had clearly just had a conversation with Vorath Sel or someone who'd talked to Vorath Sel. The Perseverance was suddenly the most politically significant ship in the galaxy. Ambassador Nair handled it with the same focused calm she handled everything. She had weekly briefings with her staff, me, her chief cultural analyst, her military liaison, and 3 specialized xenolinguists, and she kept a whiteboard on the wall of her office on which she tracked, in her neat handwriting, every variable she was currently thinking about. After the Keth'vari meeting, she added a new column on the right side of the board. She labeled it, "Those Who Are Watching." Under it she wrote, "Selhari Vorath. Pale Union." Then she drew a line underneath and wrote one more entry, "Unknown." "The unknown is always the real threat," she told me once. "It's not the enemy with 700 ships, it's the one sitting quietly learning." She was right about that. She was right about almost everything, eventually. The Selhari were easy to understand, comparatively. They were a pragmatic civilization, traders, essentially, who had expanded through commerce rather than conquest. They were smaller than the Keth'vari, less militarized, more interested in economic positioning. Their communication to us was essentially a very polished version of, "We would like to not be on the wrong side of this." Their ambassador, a Selhari named Keth'vari, who was about the size of a golden retriever, and communicated in rapid, chirping bursts that the translation system rendered as formal but slightly anxious English, arrived at the Perseverance with a trade proposal that was almost comically well prepared. 300 pages of commercial framework that had clearly been written in advance of the Keth'vari meeting, in the confidence that the Keth'vari meeting would go a particular way. "They bet on us," Major Watanabe observed, reading the proposal in the conference room while Keth'vari waited politely in the diplomatic lounge. "They bet on Vorath Sel's intelligence," Ambassador Nair corrected. "Which is almost the same thing." The Selhari negotiation took 4 days and resulted in the first formal trade agreement between humanity and a non-hostile alien civilization. It was, at the time, considered a major diplomatic achievement. Looking back, it feels like it was almost beside the point, a footnote to the real story that was developing in the background. The Vorath Communion was harder. The Vorath were something I struggled to understand even after months of study. They were a hive intelligence, not in the science fiction sense of a monolithic consciousness, but something more distributed and strange. They had individual beings, individual bodies, but their decision-making was so deeply collective that no single Vorath could articulate a position that the others hadn't already reached by a kind of constant low-level consensus. Communicating with them felt like communicating with the edge of a tide. Any one part of them you could touch, but the whole thing was somewhere else. They hadn't attacked us. They hadn't been particularly aggressive toward anyone. What they had done, according to our intelligence files, was absorb 11 civilizations over 2,000 years, not militarily but culturally. They would establish contact, establish communication, establish cultural exchange, and then, over generations, the contact civilization would become compatible. The boundaries would blur. The distinction would dissolve. It was the most peaceful form of conquest imaginable and also the most final. Their communication to us was, characteristically, less a message than a phenomenon. 47 separate transmissions, each from a different Vorath individual, arriving in an 11-hour window, each saying something slightly different in a way that, when read together, formed a complete thought. The complete thought was, "We have been watching humans for 30 years. We would like to understand what you are made of. We think this understanding may benefit both of us." Which sounded reasonable, until you remembered their history. Ambassador Nair spent 2 days reading everything we had on the Vorath Communion before she responded. I watched her work, the way she moved through documents, flagged things, went back thought. She had a habit of tapping her thumb against the table when she was processing something, a quiet rhythmic beat that meant she was really thinking. She tapped for a long time on the Vorath files. When she finally drafted a response, it was shorter than I expected. 3 paragraphs. The gist was, "We welcome understanding, we are open to dialogue, and we want to be clear from the start that human cultural identity is not a threshold that exists to be crossed." She read it to me and asked what I thought. I said it seemed like an elegant way of saying, "We're glad to talk, but we're not going to be absorbed." "That's exactly what it's saying," she said. "The question is whether they'll find that charming or alarming." "Which would we prefer?" She considered. "Charming," she said. "If they find it alarming, they might decide to work faster." But it was the Pale Union that changed everything. I want to be precise about this. The Keth'vari meeting was the day humanity established its reputation. The Selhari Agreement was the day we established our commercial presence. But the Pale Union contact was the day we finally understood what was really happening in this galaxy, and why it mattered, and why the terrifying truth that Vorath Sel had articulated was only half the story. The Pale Union. We had almost nothing on them. 6 references in our galactic census data, all of them cross-references from other civilizations' records. The Keth'vari mentioned them once, obliquely, in a political document from about 400 years ago. The Selhari had a commercial registry note indicating that the Pale Union occupied several systems in what our charts labeled the Outer Spoke, a poorly mapped region about 40 light-years from the current edge of human exploration. The Vorath files contained a single entry that read, in translation, something like, "The Pale Union watches from still water. Approach carefully." That was it. That was everything we knew. Their communication arrived 6 weeks after the Keth'vari withdrawal. It was not transmitted on any standard diplomatic frequency. It was not encrypted in any cipher we recognized. It arrived, inexplicably, on the personal communicator of Specialist Yusuf Tanaka, the communications officer who'd been having trouble sleeping. He was eating breakfast in the crew mess when it came through. He told me about it later, in that careful, slightly disbelieving way of someone who hasn't entirely processed what happened. He said the communicator just chimed. Normal notification sound. He looked at it, expecting a personal message from home, and instead found a single line of text that the universal translation system had already rendered into English. The line was, "We know what you are. We would like you to know what we are. Come to the coordinates attached." Yusuf stared at it for a long time. Then he set his breakfast tray down carefully, walked to Ambassador Nair's office, knocked, and said, "Ambassador, I think I have something." Black large square build tension. The coordinates led to a point in space that wasn't on any of our charts. That's not as unusual as it sounds. Our charts, even 60 years into the spacefaring era, had enormous gaps. But this point was unusual because it was close. Less than 3 light hours from our current position. We would have mapped it by accident under normal circumstances, simply by being in the area. Except the coordinates, when we ran them, showed up as already flagged in our system. Flagged as clear, as empty, as surveyed and confirmed barren on 3 separate passes. 3 passes that, Captain Reyes pointed out quietly, had all taken place within the last 4 years. "So it's been confirmed empty," I said. "3 times," she said. "By our own sensors." "By our own sensors," she confirmed. "And now something is there." She looked at me. "That's the question, isn't it?" We debated for 2 days. Ambassador Nair wanted to go. Major Watanabe wanted to go with enough military escort to constitute a small fleet. The Perseverance's military attaché, Commander Ellis Park, a man who had a well-earned reputation for being the calmest person in any room, wanted to send a probe first. Priya overruled all of them. We would go, in the shuttle, with a standard diplomatic configuration. Because if the Pale Union had been watching us long enough to contact us on a personal communicator, they already knew exactly what we were bringing, and sending a fleet would be the kind of response that implied we were afraid. "We're not afraid," Major Watanabe said flatly. "I know that," Ambassador Nair said. "I want to make sure they know that." Major Watanabe looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I want 4 people on the shuttle instead of 3. Priya looked at her. "Not because we're afraid," Watanabe said. "Because I prefer not to be outnumbered in an enclosed space." Priya agreed to 4. We left on a Tuesday morning. Me, Priya, Watanabe, and Yusuf Tanaka, because Priya said the fact that the message came to him directly suggested that whoever had sent it considered him a relevant contact point, and she wanted to honor that. The trip took 40 minutes. The shuttle moved through empty space. Outside the windows, nothing visible, just stars. Nothing on the short-range scanners. Nothing on the thermal imaging. Nothing on the electromagnetic sweep. And then, at exactly the coordinates the message had given, something appeared. Not on the scanners first, on the windows. One moment it was empty space, then it was not. It was a ship, or something that our brains interpreted as a ship because we needed some category to put it in. It was large, though not in the brute force way of Keth'vari warships. It was large in the way that old cathedrals are large, not just big, but constructed to make you feel the bigness. It had a quality that I kept reaching for words to describe and kept failing. The closest I got was this: it looked like it had been here before us. Not built recently, not assembled, just present. The way mountains are present, the way old forests are present. Yusuf said, very quietly, "I think they just turned off their cloaking." Nobody disagreed. Ambassador Nair looked at the ship for a long moment. Then she said, "Open a channel." The Pale Union spoke, if spoke is the right word, in a way I have never been able to fully describe, and I've tried many times. It wasn't sound exactly. It wasn't telepathy exactly. It was something that arrived in the mind with the texture of language, but without the mechanism of language. As if the meaning bypassed the usual channels and just settled there, comprehensible and unsolicited. The first thing they communicated was, in essence, "Welcome. We have been hoping you would come." The second thing was harder to render in simple terms, but I'll try. They told us they were old. Not old the way the Keth'vari were old, 3,000 years of empire and expansion. Old the way geological formations are old. They were a civilization that had existed in some form for approximately 400,000 years. 400,000 years. In 400,000 years, they had watched civilizations arise. They had watched the Keth'vari Empire build itself from a single planet species to a 600 system power. They had watched the species that built the Vorath drive, the probe we'd found between Jupiter and Saturn, live, flourish, expand, and then make a choice that the Pale Union described as the final inward turn. They had decided, those unnamed beings, that expansion was not the answer. They had gone home. They had stopped. And within a few centuries, by the Pale Union's account, they had stopped existing in a way that the Pale Union could measure. The Pale Union had watched all of this from their still water, as the Vorath had called it. Watching, recording, not intervening. "Why not?" Ambassador Nair asked. The answer took a while to articulate, but what it came down to was this. The Pale Union had decided, very long ago, that the most dangerous thing a civilization could do was decide the shape of another civilization's story. They had made that mistake once. A very long time ago. They didn't describe the details, but the weight of it was present in the way they communicated. a kind of ancient grief that didn't translate precisely but registered somewhere in the chest. So instead they watched. And they waited. For what? I asked. I didn't mean to speak directly. I was a junior attaché, not an ambassador, but the question came out before I could catch it. The response was immediate and clear. For someone who might understand why it matters. The silence that followed had a quality that I can only describe as weighted, like the air before a storm, when the pressure changes and the birds stop singing. Why us? Priya asked. Why contact us now at this moment? And they told us. Black large square climax. What the Pale Union told us, over the course of 4 hours in that shuttle, floating in empty space next to a ship that appeared to be made of something between metal and memory, was this. They had been watching humanity for longer than we'd been spacefaring. Not 60 years, not since the Vorath Drive, since before. They had been watching us from the first moment. A human being looked up at the night sky and wondered, specifically wondered, not just feared the dark but wanted to know what was in it. They couldn't say exactly when that was. They couldn't put a date on the moment when curiosity overwhelmed instinct in a species that had every survival reason to stay on the ground and keep looking down. But they had noticed it. They had flagged it. They had begun paying particular attention. Because in 400,000 years they had seen a lot of civilizations achieve space travel. It was rare but not impossible. The universe, given enough time, seemed inclined to produce minds, and minds, given enough time, seemed inclined to look up. But there were different ways to look up. Some species looked up out of fear, driven off their home worlds by catastrophe, seeking refuge. They tended, the Pale Union said, to build defensively, inward-facing. They were cautious and they were clever, and they built very good walls, and sometimes they survived for a long time inside their walls, and sometimes the walls eventually failed. Some species looked up out of resource need, running out of something essential, compelled outward by necessity. They tended to be acquisitive, expansionist, efficient. They would often grow very large very quickly, and would often eventually make a decision that the Pale Union called the calculation of enough, a point where they had enough, and stopped, and sometimes turned inward like the Vorath builders, and sometimes something else. Some species looked up because their culture demanded it, religious, philosophical, social imperatives that assigned cosmic meaning to the stars. These varied enormously. Some became the most peaceful civilizations the Pale Union had ever observed. Some became the most dangerous. And then there was a fourth category, rare enough that the Pale Union had, over 400,000 years, documented fewer than 20 examples. The category of civilizations that looked up simply because the stars were there. Not from fear, not from need, not from ideology. From something the Pale Union struggled to name, but that translated, as best the universal system could render it, as restlessness of spirit. They told us that these civilizations, the ones driven by this fourth quality, were always the most unpredictable, the most difficult to model, the most capable of sudden, inexplicable escalation and equally sudden, inexplicable kindness. They told us that these civilizations almost never survived their first contact period. Not because they were destroyed, because they were changed, because the contact period, the era when they first encountered other intelligent life, with all its complexity and threat and wonder, was the crucible, and most of these fourth category civilizations were too volatile, too reactive, to navigate it without fracturing. They told us that in 400,000 years, only 3 of the civilizations with the restlessness of spirit had made it through the contact period intact. They told us that humanity was the fourth. And they told us that they had never, in their entire recorded history, seen a species come through the contact period the way we were coming through it. Most species that survive, they communicated, do so by becoming more like the others, by learning to calculate, by learning when to stop, by becoming in some essential way less than what they were. You are not doing this. They were quiet for a moment, or whatever the Pale Union equivalent of a pause was. You are coming through the contact period more yourselves than you went in. I remember exactly how that landed. I remember Yusuf Tanaka putting both hands flat on the shuttle console, very slowly, as if he needed to feel something solid. I remember Major Watanabe, who never showed anything, pressing her lips together in a way that I had never seen before and have not seen since. I remember Ambassador Nair being very still. The Keth'vari came to understand your nature through threat, the Pale Union continued. They found it frightening. That is reasonable. What you are is frightening if you are looking for safety. But we have not been looking for safety for a very long time. We have been looking for something else. What? Priya asked. Someone who will go further, they said. Further than us, further than the Keth'vari, further than any civilization currently present in this arm of the galaxy. Further where? I asked. The answer was not a direction. It was not a coordinate. It was something that translated imperfectly as further into the question of what it means to be alive and reaching. And then they told us about the grave. The grave was the Pale Union's name for it, and I want to be precise about what it was, because the most common misunderstanding, the one that spread in the popular press after this became known, was that the grave was a single place. It wasn't. The grave was a pattern, a recurring pattern in the long arc of civilizational development that the Pale Union had documented across 400,000 years of observation. It was the moment, always different in detail, always similar in structure, when a civilization reached a certain level of power and faced a certain kind of question, and the answer they gave determined everything that followed. The question, as best as it could be translated, was this: is the universe yours to use, or are you part of something larger? Civilizations that answered ours to use tended to expand rapidly, grow powerful, consume resources on a galactic scale, and then reach a point of diminishing return, a kind of cosmic exhaustion that the Pale Union had observed ending in collapse, contraction, or simply silence. The grave. Civilizations that answered part of something larger tended to become the calm ones, the old ones, the watchful ones, like the Pale Union themselves, present but not pressing, enduring but not expanding. Neither answer, the Pale Union suggested, was entirely right. The question has been asked across 400,000 years, they said, and the answer has always been one or the other. We have begun to wonder if there is a third possibility. Which is? Priya asked. A civilization that holds both, that uses because it loves, that reaches because it cares about where the reach lands, that expands without consuming, that touches the universe without believing it belongs to them. The shuttle was very quiet. We do not know if this is possible, they said. We have never seen it. But we have seen in your species something that suggests it might be. Your care for your dead, which Vorath Sel noted, is not simply grief. It is a relationship with consequence. You act knowing that what you do will be remembered. You hold yourself accountable to the future and to the past simultaneously in a way that no species we have documented does. It makes you difficult, they said. It makes you unpredictable. It makes you, as the Keth'vari noted, an extremely expensive target. But it also makes you, perhaps, exactly what is needed. Priya was quiet for a long time after that. I watched her. I had watched her through the Keth'vari meeting, through the Selhari negotiation, through 2 years of difficult and exhausting diplomacy, and I had learned to read the quality of her silences. This one was different from all the others. This one was the silence of a person who has just been handed something very heavy and is figuring out how to carry it. Finally she said, "What do you want from us?" The Pale Union considered. "Nothing specific," they said. "We are not asking you to become something. We are not asking you to follow a path we have designed. We made that mistake once. We will not make it again." "Then why tell us this?" she asked. "Because," they said, "you should know that you are not alone in this galaxy, and you should know that some of us are hoping." "Hoping for what?" "Hoping that you make it through." Another pause. The contact period has been the crucible for every fourth category civilization. They all fracture. They fragment under the pressure of encountering others, the fear, the complexity, the temptation to become simpler, more defensive, more calculating, to stop being what they were. You are being squeezed by the same pressures. The Keth'vari, the Vorath, us. The galaxy exerts pressure on everything new that enters it. We are telling you this because we think you should feel the pressure clearly rather than be surprised by it. And because we think, we do not know, but we think, that you might be one of the ones who holds. Major Watanabe spoke for the first time in hours. Her voice was very even. "And if we don't hold?" The Pale Union were quiet for a moment. "Then you will be one more entry in a very long record," they said, "and we will continue to watch, and eventually something else will come along." "And if we do?" The answer to that was the last thing they communicated, and it was the thing that has stayed with me most completely, even now, years later. "If you do," they said, "then the record changes. And that changes everything that comes after." Black large square resolution. We returned to the Perseverance in silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, not the silence of people who have nothing to say. The silence of people carrying something they need to set down somewhere carefully before they start talking about it. Captain Reyes met us in the docking bay. She looked at our faces, and whatever she saw there made her not ask questions. She just walked with us to the conference room, closed the door, and waited. Ambassador Nair sat down. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "We need to write a very careful report." "How careful?" Commander Park asked. "Careful enough that it says everything true without causing a panic, and without making any of the wrong people feel like they need to do something dramatic." She looked around the room. "What we learned today is not a military briefing. It's not even a political briefing. It's something else." She paused. "It's a perspective, and perspectives need time." The report took 3 weeks to write. All of us contributed to it. It went through 18 drafts. The final version was classified at a level that meant only about 40 people on Earth initially read it, and I don't know when it became more widely known, or if it has. But here's what I can tell you about what we wrote. We wrote about the Keth'vari meeting, which was already known in broad strokes, the withdrawal of the fleet, the diplomatic breakthrough, the trade implications. We wrote about the Selhari agreement. We wrote about the Vorath communication and our considered approach to it. And we wrote about the Pale Union. We wrote about what they had seen in 400,000 years of watching. We wrote about the 4 categories of civilizations, and we wrote about which one humanity appeared to be. We wrote about the grave, and the pattern, and the question that civilizations faced and mostly failed. And we wrote about what the Pale Union was hoping. Not as a reason to be proud, pride was the wrong instinct, and we knew it. Not as a reason to be afraid, though there was enough in it to make fear reasonable. We wrote about it as a reason to be careful. Because the galaxy was watching. And not all of them were afraid of us. Some of them were rooting for us. And that, in some ways that were hard to articulate and easy to feel, was the weightiest thing of all. I think about Yusuf Tanaka a lot. He transferred off the Perseverance about a year after all of this, took a post on a deep space communications array near the edge of the mapped systems. I heard from him once after that, a brief message, nothing classified, just a note to say he was doing well, and the posting was quieter than he'd expected. He said he spent a lot of nights watching the stars from the observation port, which he described as a completely different experience than it used to be. I knew what he meant. When you know that somewhere out there, in the directions you can't chart and the frequencies you can't quite tune, there are civilizations that have been watching since before your species built its first city, watching not with threat, but with a kind of ancient, patient hope. The stars stop looking the same. They're still beautiful. If anything, they're more beautiful. But they're also heavier. Every point of light out there is a question you can't answer yet. Every constellation is a pattern you don't have the context to read. And somewhere in all of it, the Pale Union is keeping their record, and the Keth'vari are reassessing their assumptions, and the Vorath are learning us the way they've learned everything, slowly, persistently, through immense collective patience. And we're still here. Still reaching. Still expensive. The last time I saw Ambassador Nair was 3 years after the Perseverance deployment ended. She was at a conference in Geneva, speaking to a room full of people who mostly didn't know half of what she knew. She looked the same, compact, present, that quality of being exactly where she was. I caught her afterward, in the corridor outside the conference hall. She asked how I was. I told her I was good, which was mostly true. She asked if I was still writing. I told her I was trying to. She nodded. She looked at me for a moment with the same steadiness she'd used when she looked at Vorath Sel across a table at Relay Point 7. You know what the hardest part is, she said. What? Carrying it without it changing you in the wrong direction. She tilted her head slightly. Knowing that the galaxy is watching without letting it make you perform, without letting it make you self-conscious. The Pale Union said we were coming through the contact period more ourselves than we went in, and that's only possible if we actually stay ourselves. How do you do that? I asked. She thought about it for a moment. Same way you always have, she said. You remember what you're doing it for, not the galaxy, not the Pale Union, not some legacy you're building. She paused. You remember the 47 people on the Proxima station. You remember Grace Alderman in a damaged frigate. You remember why they did what they did. Why? I asked, though I thought I knew. Because the person next to them mattered, she said simply. Not history, not humanity, not civilization. The person next to them, that's it. That's always it. She said goodbye and walked away down the corridor, and I stood there for a while just thinking. Black large square ending line. Here is the terrifying truth that the galaxy learned about us. We aren't fearless. We're afraid of exactly the same things every living thing is afraid of: loss, pain, the dark, the end. We feel all of it. We just decided, somewhere a very long time ago, that fear wasn't a stopping point. It was a starting point. The Keth'vari couldn't calculate us because we don't stop at the number. The Pale Union saw something in us that 400,000 years of watching hadn't shown them before. Vorath Sel, with 700 warships at his back, asked one question that his strategists had never been able to answer. And the answer was never, because we're brave. The answer was, because the person next to us mattered enough to stay. That's what we are. That's the truth behind the truth. We didn't conquer the galaxy. We didn't impress it with our weapons or our technology or our grand ambitions. We impressed it, we frightened it, we moved it, we gave it something to hope for simply by being the kind of creature that runs toward the thing that scares it when someone it loves is on the other side. The galaxy wondered why it never dared attack us. Now it knows. And so do you.